All right, listeners, ready to dive deep with us? Today we're taking a look at Kristin Hanna's The Women. It's a novel set during the Vietnam War era, but it's so much more than just a war story. We'll be looking beyond the plot, to uncover how the historical and cultural context of that time really impacted the lives of the characters.
I think what's so compelling about Hannah's work is how she brings that era to life. I mean, a nation divided by war, protests erupting, traditional gender roles being challenged. It was a period of intense social upheaval, and she captures that energy brilliantly in the book.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And one of the ways she does this is through these letters that Frankie gets from home. Like, remember those mentions of draft card burnings and women burning bras? Those weren't just like isolated incidents, right? They were symptoms of a whole society grappling with this massive change.
Right. It was like the country itself was going through an identity crisis, trying to figure out who they were in this new world.
And speaking of identity, that's a huge part of what our protagonist, Frankie McGrath, is dealing with throughout the story. She starts out as this idealistic young nurse, all eager to serve in Vietnam. But war has a way of ripping away those illusions, doesn't it?
Absolutely. And you see that naivete so clearly in the beginning. The contrast between Frankie's kind of carefree going away party and her brother Finley's somber farewell. It really highlights how she's entering this war zone with these like romanticized notions of heroism. But what she finds is this brutal reality that forces her to confront not just the enemy, but also like her own beliefs and desires.
It's like she's walking into this fire, both literally and figuratively. And it's not just the physical danger, right? She's also caught in this intense love triangle with Jamie, the married doctor, and Rye, this kind of rebellious pilot. Talk about complicated.
Oh, those relationships are so central to Frankie's journey. You have Jamie on the one hand, representing stability in the life she could have had back home. And then there's Rye, embodying the danger and the thrill of the war itself. It's this constant push and pull between duty and desire, safety and risk. It's what really makes you connect with Frankie as a reader.
I agree. And then there's that just absolutely heartbreaking scene on Christmas Eve where Frankie's holding the hand of this dying soldier, this unnamed soldier. And it's made even more powerful when later on Barb points out that the official reports claimed there were no casualties that day. Wow, talk about a gut punch.
Yeah, it's a pivotal scene for sure because it really exposes how the government was trying to control the narrative around the war. You have Frankie experiencing the horrors of combat firsthand, while back home people are being fed this like sanitized version of events, and that disparity just fuels Frankie's disillusionment and forces her to question everything she thought she knew.
It's this stark reminder that truth is often the first casualty in war, isn't it?
Sadly, yes.
And that disillusionment, combined with everything else she experiences in Vietnam, leads to Frankie struggling with PTSD when she returns home. And it's just heartbreaking to see how her trauma is dismissed, especially by those closest to her.
I think what's so striking about Hannah's portrayal of PTSD is that it really highlights those invisible wounds of war. Frankie's scars aren't physical, but they're emotional and psychological. And her family's inability to understand what she's going through really speaks volumes about the lack of awareness and support for veterans, particularly women, during that time.
Yeah, it's like they expect her to just slip back into her old life, but how can you go through something like that and not be completely changed?
Exactly. And it makes you wonder how many other veterans suffered in silence because their pain wasn't acknowledged or understood.
Right, that's a really important point.
It is.
And it brings us to another key theme that Hannah explores: identity. The war forces Frankie to confront who she is, not just as a woman, but as a human being, capable of incredible strength and resilience. And one small but really interesting detail is how she resists wearing a dress in Vietnam. Like, she prefers to wear her fatigues.
Oh, that's such a great
It's
observation.
almost like a subtle rebellion against these societal norms she's always known.
It is, yeah. It's like she's shedding that old self, the one defined by expectations and limitations, and embracing this new identity that's forged in the fires of war.
Exactly. And this transformation, it's not just about defiance, right? It's about survival. In a war zone, traditional gender roles become meaningless. Frankie has to adapt, become resourceful and independent to navigate the chaos and danger around her.
Absolutely. And you see this journey of self-discovery playing out throughout the novel. As Frankie confronts the horrors of war and the complexities of her own heart, she starts to question everything she once believed in. And ultimately, it leads her to forge this new path for herself.
It's an incredible journey, and we're only just scratching the surface here. We'll delve deeper into Frankie's transformation and the impact of the war on her relationships in our next segment, so stay tuned, listeners.
It's not just Frankie who goes through these massive changes. Look at Barb, for instance. She challenges racial barriers and becomes such a strong support system for Frankie. Or Ethel, who finds love and happiness after all the loss she's experienced. They each embody this theme of resilience that runs through the entire book.
Yeah, you're right. It's like they each represent a different facet of womanhood,
Yeah.
facing their own unique challenges, but ultimately finding a way to rise above them. I think it's really interesting how Hannah uses clothing to symbolize Frankie's inner turmoil. Remember when she's back in San Diego?
Mm.
And she insists on wearing her old army t-shirt and fatigues, even though they're all faded and worn.
Oh, absolutely. It's such a powerful image because it shows how she's clinging to that part of herself that she found in Vietnam, that sense of purpose and strength. She's not quite ready to let go of it, even if it doesn't fit into her old life anymore.
Right, like she's wearing her armor, protecting herself from a world that just doesn't understand what she's been through. And that scene in the operating room where she has that flashback, it's so raw.
Yeah.
You could practically feel the panic and disorientation she's experiencing.
That scene is so important because it really drives home the lasting impact of trauma. Frankie may be back in the States physically, but mentally and emotionally, she's still reliving those horrors of war. And then you add the fact that her own father is ashamed of her service. It just adds another layer of pain to her experience.
It's like she's being punished for her bravery. It's so difficult to watch her family, even with good intentions. They just don't get it. They want her to just move on and forget, but it's not that simple.
It's just not.
The war has fundamentally changed her, and those wounds, they don't heal overnight.
It's a powerful reminder that the deepest wounds are often the ones we can't see. And this lack of understanding really contributes to Frankie's struggle to find her place back home in a society that's seemingly moved on without her.
It's like she no longer fits in.
Exactly.
And amidst all of this, she's also dealing with the loss of Jamie, right? Her forbidden love.
Right.
It's a tragedy, but in a way, it also kind of frees her. It allows her to explore those feelings for Rye, who, let's face it, has been there in the background all along.
It's interesting how Hannah uses those two men to represent different aspects of Frankie's desires. Jamie symbolizes stability, that conventional life she could have had. And Rye represents the wildness of the war, the passion and danger. It's like Frankie needs to experience both extremes to truly understand herself.
And we can't forget about all the symbolism woven throughout the story, like the unnamed soldier on Christmas Eve. He represents so much more than just a single casualty. He embodies the countless lives lost,
Yeah.
and the government's attempts to downplay the true cost of war.
Right. And the stone Rye gives Frankie and her St. Christopher medal. They symbolize the connection they forge amidst all the chaos.
Yeah.
This shared understanding that goes beyond words.
Exactly. It's both beautiful and heartbreaking. And then there's that scene where she throws her brother's portrait onto her father's wall of heroes. It's such a powerful act of defiance. Like she's finally rejecting that idealized image of war that her father represents.
Oh, that moment is so visceral. You can feel the anger and grief pouring out of her. She's shattering the illusion of a good war, forcing everyone to acknowledge the messy, complicated reality.
And it's such a turning point in her relationship with her father, right? It's
Yeah.
painful, but it's also honest. And it opens the door, at least potentially, for a more genuine connection between them.
It really makes you wonder if true reconciliation is even possible, given their vastly different perspectives on the war and Frankie's role in it. But I think that's what makes this novel so thought-provoking. It doesn't shy away from these difficult questions. It leaves you grappling with the complexities of family and forgiveness and the long-lasting impacts of war.
And speaking of lasting impacts, what about the novel's wider cultural significance? The Women was published decades after the Vietnam War ended. Why do you think this story continues to resonate with readers today?
Well, I think it resonates because it speaks to these universal truths, about love and loss and that search for identity. Even if you haven't personally experienced war, you can still connect with Frankie's struggles with societal expectations, her desire for connection, her journey of self-discovery.
Right, and let's be honest, the ending is not your typical happily ever after. She doesn't end up with Jamie or Rye.
No, she doesn't.
Instead, she chooses herself, walks away from her engagement with Henry, because she knows she can't build a life on a lie.
Exactly. And that's what makes it so powerful. It's a real testament to Frankie's resilience and her newfound sense of agency. She's not defined by the men in her life anymore or by the expectations of others. She's choosing her own path, even if it's unconventional, even if it's difficult.
It's like the war, as horrific as it was, actually set her free. It stripped away everything she thought she knew, forced her to confront her deepest fears and desires. And through that process, she found this strength she never knew she had.
And you know that final scene at the Vietnam War Memorial? It brings everything full circle. Frankie finds solace and connection among other veterans, men and women who truly understand the weight of her experiences.
It's a beautiful moment of closure, for sure. But it also raises some interesting questions, like how do you think Frankie's story might have been different if she had received more support, more understanding from her family and society?
That's a great question. I think it really highlights the importance of empathy and compassion, especially when it comes to those who have served in war. Frankie struggles with PTSD. They could have been eased if she had felt safe sharing her experiences, if she had felt supported.
Absolutely. It makes you think about how many other veterans, both men and women, have suffered in silence because their pain wasn't acknowledged or understood.
It's a sobering thought, and I think the women challenges us as a society to do better, to listen more attentively to the stories of veterans, to provide them with the resources and support they need to heal.
It's a powerful reminder that the impact of war goes way beyond the battlefield, and that true healing requires a collective effort.
Exactly. And while the women focuses on the Vietnam War era, the themes of resilience, identity, and the enduring impact of trauma, those are timeless. Those are universal. It's a story that speaks to the human condition in all its complexities.
Well said. So, as we wrap up our deep dive into the women, I want to leave you with this thought. This novel is a testament to the power of storytelling. It illuminates the human experience, challenges us to confront uncomfortable truths, to celebrate the strength of the human spirit, and to honor the sacrifices of those who have served our country. If our deep dive has sparked your curiosity, I encourage you to explore more of Kristin Hanna's work. Her novels often feature strong female characters, navigating challenging historical events. Thank you for joining us.